2, 3, 4.
Y'all ready for this?
Ladies and gentlemen.
Never been done before.
We're talking about a subject.
To bring you to the light.
Farewell to you, people.
Word up.
I'm Tonda Sizwe Shimaringa, and you're tuned to Hard Knock Radio on the Pacifica Network. We're looking at recent political wins that are reshaping New York. New York State Assembly member Zohran Mamdani won the New York City Democratic mayoral primary in June of this year, and the push is on to derail his campaign. Fairness and accuracy in reporting, also known as FAIR, the national media watch group that has been offering well-documented criticism of media bias and censorship since 1986, ran an article on July 30th detailing how the Wall Street Journal ran 10 op-eds in 1 week, 10 in 1 week, attacking Mamdani. Then on August 4th, FAIR noted how media were blaming not current Mayor Eric Adams, but Mamdani for the mass shooting that occurred in New York City on July 28th, when Shane Devin Tamura walked into an office building in Midtown Manhattan with an assault rifle and shot and killed 4 people, seriously wounded 1 other person, and then killed himself. Mamdani had been out of the country at the time of the shooting. Most recently, former President Barack Obama has phoned Mamdani, and although we don't know what they talked about, some folks are worried about that. The reason some folks are worried about that is because they say, and I'll tell you who they are in a minute, or should I say, it has been said that the Democratic Party is where movements go to die. I wanted to explore that further with my guest today, Dylan Rodriguez, who is the distinguished professor in the Department of Black Study and the Department of Media and Cultural Studies, and he was previously in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Riverside. Dylan, thank you so much for being on Hard Knock Radio today.
They do not know what they did putting Tonda Sizwe Chimurenga in charge of this airwave right here. It is an honor as always. It is an honor as always to be on your show, Tondi. For people listening to this,
show,
we go.
Dylan.
Yo, no. Today it is. Today it is. Today it is. Today it is.
Knocks Radio. I'm sitting in for
it is Hard Knocks Radio. Hey, Davey D, respect. Hard Knocks Radio, respect. I literally grew up with Hard Knocks Radio in the 90s. I lived in the Bay Area from 95 to 2001. Hard Knocks Radio was it. Still is it. But today, I just want people out there to know I go back 25 plus years with Tondi Chimurenga, and it is an honor as always to be on the air with you to talk about some things that are crucial to demystifying the way some of our earnest, serious, and principled people might be misled, might be misinformed, might be miseducated. This is a principal point of conversation. I'm glad that you started this off and invited me on to talk about it.
Sounded like Malcolm X, been had, took, and misled. Is that what you're saying?
Real. I mean, that's the least of it, right? I mean, that was when Malcolm would say that was always a precursor to, a 45-minute to hour and a half lecture where he would get down into details. He'd produce historical receipts. He would think about some living archives, and he would hash out an argument. So, I want to make sure that we understand that before there was such a thing as a soundbite, Malcolm X was already introducing the whole concept of counter propaganda against liberal and right wing propaganda, and that was just an invitation. So when Malcolm X would say stuff like that, that was an invitation. That was an invitation to come in and join him for some study. So like I think all of us should be doing our best to try to work and think within the tradition of Malcolm X for sure, just like you said.
So at least 60 years ago, and that would be 1965. So at minimum 65 years ago, Malcolm X told us about the fox and the wolf. The Democrats and the Republicans. They were both canines, they were both predators. One bared his teeth, the other one was slick. But again, they're both predators, they're both canines, they are both stalking black people. The Democratic Party being the place where movements go to die. You said that's what, the tip of the iceberg? Is that what you said?
No, I said, I wish it was that. I wish it was that benign.
Okay.
It's so much worse than that. It's so much worse than that.
Okay, well,
And
talk to our
and
audience
I
about
appreciate,
that.
I appreciate the fact that you started us out with Malcolm X. We're in Black August, and we're still fighting the struggle around unrecognized U.S. political prisoners and prisoners of war, Black liberation struggle. So Malcolm X is a fitting way to kind of stay. Let's kind of stay with Malcolm X here and thinking about his political analogy, of particularly of the fox, because another way to think about that lesson, maybe starting from around 1960, 1965. So let's think about this last 60 or so years. And let's fix our attention on the Democratic Party. A lot of people listening to this are probably familiar with the counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, what the FBI undertook, during the middle part of the 20th century into the late part of the 20th century to infiltrate, undermine, and destroy radical revolutionary and liberation movements in the United States, internal to the United States, right? From Black liberationists, Puerto Rican independentistas, the anti-war movement, even the liberal progressive arms of the civil rights movement. So people are familiar with the counterintelligence program and the role of the FBI. That's the form of what we could call domestic counterinsurgency that I think a lot of politically educated and activated people are relatively familiar with. What I think folks are still struggling to learn about collectively is this other dimension of domestic counterinsurgency that is precisely what Malcolm X was gesturing toward when he talked about the fox in the hen house. And that's principally, I would argue, it's a combination of the Democratic Party, generally in concert and coordination with the rise of what's come to be known, and which is particularly relevant in the Bay Area, as the nonprofit industrial complex. So, yeah. So when we think about what the Democratic Party did around the period of time that you're talking about here, when we think about the Democratic Party playing a very specific role, an important role in building domestic warfare around a certain phase of counterinsurgency, we got to understand what counterinsurgency is. I think that there is oftentimes an assumption that when we use a term like counterinsurgency, we're primarily or maybe exclusively talking about violent, repressive police and state activity against Black liberation and other liberation movements, other radical and revolutionary and anti-colonial movements. That's one part of counterinsurgency. At its heart, what counterinsurgency actually is, it's about defending and or reassembling the legitimacy of state power. That's what it's actually about. It's a war over legitimacy, y'all, right? It's not just a war to repress radicals and revolutionaries. It's a war to rescue the legitimacy of the existing power structure, okay? And this is what Malcolm was talking about when he introduced us to this parable of the fox, right? The Democratic Party has built and expanded its role alongside the nonprofit industrial complex, such that it's extended its tentacles into almost every imaginable realm of politics and culture. To do what? Well, so the primary thing it is interested in is precisely that primary and foundational aim of counterinsurgency: to defend, to reassemble, and sometimes to reform state power so it can win back legitimacy among those very people who may be in active insurrection against it. Okay, so it's about the legitimacy of existing state power and the legitimacy of an existing political economic order, in this case, racial capitalism. So when we think about the Democratic Party, it's not just where movements go to die, right? It's not just, so that assumes the Democratic Party just sitting still. The Democratic Party is activated. They are sending people into movements to recruit operatives, right? To recruit people who will run for elected office. That this happened with the Black Panther Party. It happened all over the place, right? So when we think about the Democratic Party, it's quite active, it's quite mobilized, and it actively seeks to wage counterinsurgency warfare in a kind of liberal progressive, in a liberal progressive kind of cosplay, oftentimes by way of appropriating, that is stealing, the language and ideas that radical and revolutionary movements have constructed, right? Whether it's abolition, whether it's decolonization, whether it's radical trans justice, whether it's whether it's disability justice, whether it's something else. This is what the Democratic Party has been doing in a really intensive way for the last 6 decades. And the last thing I'll say on this point, the Democratic Party does not only steal language and ideas, it steals people, right? Like, we could go through a roster of people who got their training, their political education, who frankly were radicalized. And I mean radicalized not in the right-wing sense. I mean radicalized in a liberatory sense, right? Radicalized as radical feminists, as radical abolitionists, as anti-colonialists, in collective grassroots organizations, collectives, and movements. And oftentimes, this apparatus, this combination of the Democratic Party and the nonprofit apparatus, they will actively recruit some of the most promising and smart people from these generally, oftentimes, autonomous, grassroots, community-based collectives, and try to incorporate them into their own apparatuses. And those folks end up doing the work of legitimation. And so that's what we're talking about. When we're following the lesson of Malcolm X, I would argue that this is an important part of what he was teaching us shortly before he himself was assassinated and neutralized, although never fully destroyed, right? Never fully destroyed, because presente, right? Never fully destroyed by the counterintelligence program.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, we're talking about Malcolm X, but what you said makes me think about another soldier, another warrior for our people, another warrior against oppression, who we exalt during the month of Black August, George Jackson, in Blood in My Eye, when he asks a question. He says, prestige bars any serious attack on power. Do people attack a thing they consider with awe, with a sense of its legitimacy? So you talked about counterinsurgency as the attempt of the state to reassert, regain, reclaim, recoup its legitimacy.
There was perhaps no more important figure in this hemisphere, intellectually, strategically, and theoretically, than George Jackson over this very same period that we're talking about, meaning the last about 60 to 65 or so years, ongoing 60 years, ongoing almost 70 years. And the reason I say that is because what George Jackson, I think, understood in real time with dense, studied, theoretical seriousness were both sides of the counterinsurgency apparatus. The one side that he knew was out to destroy him, right? That he knew that he was on borrowed time, right? So he understood that part of counterinsurgency very well. That's why it is impossible to talk about George Jackson without simultaneously thinking about the long record of, radical collective insurgency and insurrection that he cultivated in dense and studied ways with his incarcerated comrades and with so-called free world comrades. So he understood that part. At the same time, it's his work that I think has trained increasingly serious and militant collectives of people around the pitfalls of liberal and progressive state reform as the other side of counterinsurgency. And by and large, this has been pushed by the Democratic Party, and especially by progressive, so-called progressive Democratic Party operatives and interest groups. George Jackson understood that struggle over legitimacy was nothing short of warfare. And he understood that the liberation of colonized people, the liberation of Black people, the overthrow of an anti-Black and chattel and colonial civilization relied on waging successful counterwar against this genocidal anti-Black legitimacy that sits in the state, that sits in the existing political economic order. He understood that better than anybody. So I think that this is an entirely appropriate way to think about what we mean when we say, on the one hand, that maybe movements go to die with the Democratic Party, and then on the other hand, the Democratic goes out and it seeks to actually appropriate, extract from, and neutralize movements as well.
So then what do we say to people like right now today who are up in arms over Trump? They are up in arms over Project 2025, up in arms over what ICE is doing. They've just been given billions and billions more dollars to run through the streets. They've got the alligator Alcatraz down there in Florida. What do we say to these folks who believe with all their heart that Kamala should have been the choice and that we've got to go Democratic the next time elections come around?
It's really important that we understand that liberalism is something like a religion. It oftentimes will morph from being a political position that you can actually engage and argue with, into something that is closer, that more closely resembles, something like religious faith. In other instances, it might more closely resemble something like a political cult. Okay, and what I mean by that is the absolute state of denial that we are confronted with many of our loved ones and comrades, or maybe not comrades, right? I think it's actually important that we start telling people who might presume that they're our comrades, that they're not acting like our comrades, that they're actually acting like our enemies, to the extent that they are invested in doing work alongside the state or with the electoral apparatus and with the Democratic Party, as you talk about it, Tandy. The denial that a lot of our folks are in is around the fact of the collapse. When we think about something like the emergence of Donald Trump's candidacy in 2016, right? So let's go to the first candidacy. That was primary evidence of the ongoing implosion of the United States, right? As a global empire, for sure. At bare minimum, it's the implosion of the United States as a global empire. Those days are limited. The only way in which it's holding on to it is a kind of flimsy grip on global political economy and a flimsy grip on a classical old school military, right? Project 2025, if you read the document, don't even read the whole thing. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages. Read the executive summary. Read the first 10 or 15 pages of Project 2025. What that document tells us is that the architects, the writers of Project 2025, they recognize that the United States of America is already fully in a period of collapse, and they are trying to take full advantage of it. Okay, that's what I think we got to tell our people, Tandy. Right, these right wingers, the people that we are now naming as fascists, right? People that even the liberals are naming as fascists, they fully recognize the period of collapse is already here. There's no point in trying to deny it. There's no point in trying to reassemble it. They are interested in assembling power around the collapse. Okay, and to the extent that too many of our loved ones are wannabe comrades, right, who might be acting like our enemies rather than more than they're acting like our comrades, to the extent that our folks, or the people who presume that they're our folks, are still invested in trying to rescue this existing electoral and state apparatus, they are 10 steps behind the architects of Project 2025. They are 10 steps behind the people who, in the administrative state apparatus, who have arranged for these asymmetric mass mobilizations of ICE agents, an expansion of ICE as a domestic war apparatus, as both to do what it's doing, which is to terrorize, right? It's to actually actively inflict, semi-legitimated and absurd and gratuitous and deeply self-discrediting forms of state terror, right? It's an experiment, right? What Project 2025 tells us is that when you're in a period of collapse, what the most fascistic and authoritarian elements of power will actively do is they will engage in the most apparently spectacular and absurd and terroristic forms of power as an experiment to test what the boundaries of legitimacy actually are, because the state form, because the political economy, because the nation is already in a period of collapse. So frankly, I think we need to communicate to people is that they got to stop believing in the American project.
Mm.
They got to stop believing in that. They got to acknowledge. They got to acknowledge what George was already anticipating. George Jackson was already anticipating as he wrote "Blood in My Eye." He was already observing the initial phase of collapse that we are talking about here. And by the way, when I say collapse, I don't just mean the political economy. I don't just mean the electoral apparatus and the Democratic Party. I'm talking about climate collapse, right? The folks that are listening to us right now, we live in California. California is exhibit A of climate collapse as it is manifesting in the United States. There is no going back. There is no going back to California being free of wildfires, free of energy grid collapse, free of in significant parts of California, like where we live, drought. You know, the preciousness and the constant denial and lack of water, of access to potable water. There's no going back. So when we talk about collapse, the evidence is all around us. And I think we frankly just need to start talking in real terms with our people, that especially those that we love, that we care about, that they gotta understand, they gotta embrace the fact that we are living in collapse, and we gotta come up with different strategies to build power in ways that will resist authoritarian administrative power, that will resist state terror, and will not force us to rely on that very same state to survive the collapse, and for that matter, to thrive in the collapse, because I don't think it's a sad thing that the U.S. is collapsing.
I'm speaking with Dylan Rodriguez, distinguished professor in the Department of Black Study and the Department of Media and Cultural Studies at the University of California, Riverside. We were talking about the Democratic Party and how it is where movements go to die. We got into a bunch of stuff, but I saw a piece on Instagram. You keep alluding to it. I need you to spell it out. There was a clip of you on Instagram which talked about literally the murderous hand of the Democratic Party. Not democratic principles, but the Democratic Party and their murderous hand in, not being the place where the movements go to die, but actually killing the movements. And I want to go back to that.
I mean, I got to be honest with you, Tanya. I don't know the clip you're talking about, but I'm glad it's out there. I'm glad somebody caught me saying that, because I do mean it. I do mean it. I could have meant many different things by that. But the Democratic Party is. So let me make sure that folks understand this. The Democratic Party is an internally complex institution. There are many different kinds of political positions within the Democratic Party. People argue with each other, they hate each other, they support each other, they fund each other. Okay. At the same time, the Democratic Party nonetheless is a ruling totality. There's no denying that. It is a coherent ruling establishment. And its complexity is actually what makes it so powerful. Because within its complexity, the apparatus, the Democratic Party apparatus, it will provide you Brandon Johnson in Chicago, will provide you, our mayoral candidate in New York City, Mamdani, right? It'll provide you, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, so-called AOC. It'll provide you the so-called squad. It'll provide you former Representative Cori Bush, right? So it'll provide those things. And if we take a step back and understand the significance of figures like this, when we put aside for a moment, for the sake of argument, we put aside what might be substantial differences in their policy positions, right? As minoritized as those policy positions might be, right? And as much as we might admire and support those policy positions, and I do, okay, and I do support those policy positions. But if we put that aside for just a moment, what we also have to understand is that the Democratic Party's willingness to tolerate these figures, including Bernie Sanders, right, during the presidential election in 2016, right, the willingness to tolerate these left liberal, left progressive, pseudo socialist type figures is entirely in the service of legitimating the capacity of the state to absorb those who we would impute with radical positions. And let's be really clear here. The folks I'm talking about, they might have held radical positions prior to becoming elected officials. Okay, I don't doubt that, right? I know people who know those folks, right? And they will testify to that all day, how radical they were at a certain period of time when they were organizers in the community, and will defend the fact that as soon as they became invested in the electoral system, as soon as they became candidates for elected office and therefore had to join the Democratic Party, had to put all that stuff aside. That's a given, right? So when we talk about the murderous hand of the Democratic Party kills politics. It kills who people are. It turns them into some other kind of deformed, respectable, business suit wearing version of themselves that talks proper and doesn't cuss anymore, just like you told me not to cuss when I came on your show today. Right, so I'm doing my best impression of what I'd be like if I was in the Democratic Party today.
Oh my
before I'm live there, and the FCC is here looking at us. So yeah, I got you. So this is what, but this is what we're talking about: the Democratic Party. And so not only does it siphon off and neutralize people who are smart, who have radical positions, who are effective organizers. It does this all the time. Look what happened during and after 2020, the insurrections of 2020, in which people all over the planet, okay, not just in the US, all over the planet, in various ways were questioning, if not directly and militantly opposing, the legitimacy of police power, at minimum. A lot of people were actually beginning to question the legitimacy of state power as a concept throughout 2020. This is undeniable, right? This is what people were in this, like we were there. Tandy, like I know we were in different parts of this place, watching and listening and talking and thinking alongside people who were asking these serious questions, questioning the legitimacy of the state. And I think it is crucial to pay close attention to the work the Democratic Party did alongside the liberal and progressive arms of the nonprofit industrial complex to pacify, to neutralize, to absorb, and for that matter, to institutionally empower certain elements of the uprisings during and beyond 2020 against state power, to reintegrate them into conversations and participation in the state. So that's murderous. That's murderous. That's killing who people are. That is killing the capacity to build autonomous forms of knowledge, of power, and of strategy. And thankfully, I will say I'm not here to be doom and gloom about it, because I'm here, I'm alive, I'm thriving with this, and I'm thinking with you about this because there are proliferating communities of people who are continuing to insist on doing precisely that, which is to refuse the murderous hand of the Democratic Party, to refuse state power. And I think it's people who recognize that we are already in a period of collapse, right? And we have no choice. We have no choice but to be engaged in these conversations, these forms of collectivity, which may or may not involve organizations, right? They might just involve collectives, thinking experimentally. Some people have been calling it mutual aid, right? I think that's the tip of the self-determined autonomous iceberg, is what people have started calling mutual aid in the kind of radical solidarity, liberationist, and abolitionist sense.
That's the voice of Dylan Rodriguez, distinguished professor in the Department of Black Study, the Department of Media and Cultural Studies at the University of California, Riverside. Today on Hard Knock Radio, we have been discussing the murderous hand of the Democratic Party. We've been discussing the legitimacy and the illegitimacy of the state. Dylan, for listeners who want to read more of your writings or hear more of your discussions, how can they keep up with you?
Hit me on email. That's one way, dylanrodriguez.collective@gmail.com. I guess you could hit me on Instagram. I think it's at dylanrodriguez73. But if you go to my Instagram page, there should be a link tree on there where folks should be able to access a bunch of stuff for free. But more importantly, just reach out, because I want to be in community with people. I mean, this is all that matters, Tandy. That's all that matters. So yes, I'd really be honored to be invited into community with people in whatever way I can be useful to helping cohere and build and strengthen community. Please invite me.
Thank you so much, Dylan, for your time. Thank you for your work, your example. Thank you for being on Hard Knock Radio today.
I love you, Tandy. Want to make sure I say that.
I love you too, brother.
All right.
Hard knock, turn the speakers in your car up. Quality program, turn in for the real talk, don't stop. Ian man at it again, Sam man, Daddy man, Chris Juwan again. Innovation, stimulating ill conversation. Anything else is just imitation, simulation. Step into the zone, the Bay Area zone. Hard Knock Radio, let's go. Big shout Anita and Davey D. Yeah, right, feel me? Yeah. Holding down at Hard Knock Radio.
Hard Knock Radio.
Kinda crazy though. Oakland, stand up.
Yeah. Stand up.
Ensemble, Big Now Wolves.
Kansas City.
Yeah.
Bellevue.
Come on.
Check out. Why every obvious think they hard knock when they ain't going all in and ain't paid the cost of the fee? Hating that they made they beats trying to eat till they ready from the still crave beef. Say please, maybe they'll save you a seat at the table where they break bread, making a speech, second piece to their lovers I name with a please. Haters throwing shade on your name in the street. You go, hey, Davey D.
Real Talk Radio.
You and I rocking with the best in the West.
West Coast. Monday through Friday.
Sing it, Chris.
East Coast.